No, don't leave. It's okay. Just put it.
Director Sean Baker's comedy drama Anora took home 5 Oscars this year, tying with Walt Disney for the most number of awards given during the Academy show. But what if I told you a humble little movie called Takeout would be my pick for the director's best? Anora has been described as a screwball drama about a stripper who marries the son of a Russian oligarch in Vegas, only to have the marriage annulled by the kid's wealthy parents. Many people have said that Anora is a film about class, wealth inequality, and sex work. And of course, while it is many of those things, I think that it's primarily about youth and blind optimism, perhaps even naivete. Takeout follows a delivery man trying to make ends meet for his family back in China. He falls victim to loan sharks when someone offers to pay the remainder of his loan. It's believable that the character would do so. At this point, we've already followed the main character Ming through his race to earn as much money as possible in one night, taking as many deliveries as he can. In Anora, I find it a little bit harder to suspend my disbelief. Part of that is due to its subject matter. I mean, how often do you meet a Russian oligarch's son who wants to marry you? But also because of the way the movie is structured in seemingly 2 distinct parts. In the first part, the movie is told in a fairly straightforward manner. It's not until halfway through that we're introduced to the screwball humor, when Annie is held hostage by the oligarch's goons. Because of this sudden tonal shift, I found it hard to follow along with the humor. I actually saw the movie twice, and the second time was in the theater. I found that people in the theater were even having a hard time following the humor of the story. While I could catch on because I watched it a second time, I find that because we're not sure what the goons are doing and what's happening at this point, it's hard to catch the screwball nature of what's happening. I do think that the funniest parts of the movie actually come with the character expositions. Like when Annie beats up all of the goons, but one of the toughest guys keeps saying things like, "I want to go home." Baker has said that he's been influenced by cinema verite and Italian neorealism, which basically focus on very realistic filmmaking. It's been brought up in the analysis of Anora for its similarities. I personally don't like those comparisons in this specific film because of the way it's shot. Italian neorealism, for example, relied on elements like wide shots, natural settings, and non-actors. It embodied an ethos, rejecting Hollywood glamour that glossed over realities of war and post-war. For me, adding a fantasy element to the title of neorealism and the topic of sex work feels just a little bit icky to me. Not only does it feel a little bit voyeuristic and exploitative of a downtrodden subculture like many people have mentioned, I think that it robs the genre of the strongly cultural context that it exists in. So something else that people have mentioned about this film unavoidably is the male gaze. And it's hard to argue that that doesn't exist in the film. I mean, some people have already mentioned that it is filmed by a male director, which is inherent. I'm personally not sure about that. I think that might depend more on how the topic of sex work is portrayed in the film. However, you could argue there is certainly some male gaze in the first scene, which sets the tone for the movie, which starts with a topless shot of Mikey Madison. I don't think you necessarily have to do that to have a good movie. It comes across as a little bit shock and awe for me. So in some ways, it is one-dimensional. For example, the Pretty Woman-esque plot of Annie's fantasy of being married to a rich young man she meets as a client. From many sex worker accounts I've heard, this is a fantasy that some women do have, but it's far from realistic. I've heard many women say to the contrary, they would never date a client, as their reliance on making a living requires of them not to be exclusive. In other ways, I do think that this film does get a little more nuanced, and I think that's especially true when looking at Annie's portrayal and Mikey Madison's performance, particularly the way that she embraces Annie as having some humanity, as being non-stereotypical in ways where she's tough and she's not some victim. So I think when it comes to the male gaze, this movie is complex. In some ways, it does better than other movies like this, like Pretty Woman, but in other ways, it still employs tropes and stereotypes, such as being rescued by a wealthy man. Now, people have criticized Baker for being voyeuristic in other films, but I don't think the same criticism applies as strongly to Takeout because it's filmed in a much more naturalistic way. It's often filmed with a handheld camera and in very tight corners. It's very realistic. And much of the actors just go on as if they're just living their day. It feels like the director stepped out of the film. I think the character portrayals are undoubtedly the strongest aspect of this film, particularly Mikey Madison's performance of Annie. Of course, she won an Oscar for her performance as she depicts Annie in the most generous way. So there were 3 times that I cried in this movie, and Mikey Madison was behind every single moment. I think she is very skilled at expressing her emotions and letting them build and develop as the camera is on her. For example, in one moment when the goons come after Yvonne, there's a moment where he says, "She's not a hooker, she is a stripper." And he jolts back in shock, disappointment, and even disgust. It came across to me as though he was saying she wasn't worthy of being referred to as his wife, not even a human. Another moment is when she realizes her marriage might not be as serious as she'd hoped. In my view, she has such a long developing look of sadness, resignation, and acceptance at the same time.
I want to talk to Yvonne before agreeing to any of this.
Baker's characters are so strong in a plot-driven film. You know, there's a scene where they're all sitting around a restaurant table, and each character seems to exist in their own character world, responding as if they would from their personalities. And the script isn't merely functioning to move the action along. Even the mannerisms reflect that, like the way the biggest goon is limping around after being beat up by Annie. I think Baker's tendency to do this really shines through in Takeout because it's a slow, natural build where you get to see the characters' personalities. Ming, the main character, doesn't speak very much, but throughout the movie as we progress, we kind of see a little bit more what he's like. We see how when he's in the elevator with 2 younger men, he's being made fun of for the clothing he wears, suggesting that he's not really up on trends. To me, this is an example of show, don't tell, and it's executed extremely well. On fantasy, innocence, and naivety. I think this is epitomized in the Vegas scene where they get married. They're both giddy, not anticipating the consequences of their actions as they get married. Meanwhile, they've only known each other for a few days at this point. They go on a bender with their friends and, party all night long. Ivan is portrayed as a big kid playing video games and smoking weed all day. Even when Annie says she has to go back to work because she has things to do, Ivan responds with almost panic. He has a shocked look on his face as he doesn't want her to leave, asking her to stay and be exclusive with him, almost like a child who can't let go of his mother's leg.
Don't go. Don't go yet.
No, dude, I have to go to work. I have shit to do, okay? But text me if you want to see me again, yeah?
What? No. Okay. I have one question.
While Ivan is undoubtedly kid-like in this film, I think that definitely applies to Annie as well. For example, when she's in the club with her friends talking about getting married, she said she wants a Disney princess suite.
You know those suites where it's like the Disney princess theme? Cinderella. Yes, fucking Cinderella. You know me so fucking well, babe.
Both seem almost like orphans in different ways, without parents who guide them. I think this movie has problems midway through. It almost feels like 2 different movies, 2 different styles. Lots happens in the first half with relatively fast pacing, which is lost later on. In contrast, Takeout is very consistent. It kind of has the same tone throughout the movie, almost too much so. It could be the one argument that I might make at that film is that there's just a lot of the same scene happening. I think Anora is too slick and fast-paced to be considered neorealistic. Perhaps it's a hybrid of different sorts of movies, but I think that's where movies like Takeout really shine. So one thing I really took away upon my second watch of Anora is I think that Sean Baker could be very, very strong at character development and character exposition. I really wish that he did that in Anora more. It seems a little bit flat, perhaps a little shallow and not quite as deep as it could have been. I think that he could have let Annie shine even more given her backstory and complex, psychology. But with all this talk of fantasy and realism comes the question, is perhaps Sean Baker developing a new genre? It would be really interesting. I think he's doing something very creative that I haven't seen very many directors do. And I think it's very interesting to see where, I think it will be very interesting to see where Sean Baker takes his style. I think that Anora is not a perfect film, but I think that he is getting to somewhere that could be very fascinating. It sort of reminds me of Parasite if it wasn't completely polished like Parasite was. I think that that film was certainly worthy of its wins that it got. Baker has said that he puts a high importance on the last scene, and you can definitely see that throughout his films. I think that that's actually one of his strengths. The ending scene of Anora just struck me right in the heart. I definitely was crying in that moment. It was one of the moments that I cried. But Takeout has a similar kind of ending, and it kind of leaves you wondering what happens to these characters afterwards. What if in My Small World, Anora isn't Oscar worthy, but Sean Baker is, and he certainly has what it takes to keep making very interesting films, perhaps arrive at a new film genre, and keep being nominated for Oscars? Let me know what you think, and thanks so much for staying tuned.